In the dead of winter, long before electricity or central heat, when the sun barely skimmed the horizon and the night stretched endlessly, survival was not a given. In the dead of winter, long before electricity or central heat, when the sun barely skimmed the horizon and the night stretched endlessly, survival was not a given. It was earned, hour by hour, ember by ember. Tonight we begin not with kings or castles, but with the forgotten millions. Peasants whose names were never written down, but whose endurance shaped the silent foundation of history. Life for them was not romantic nor picturesque. It was a battle against the cold, quiet, constant, and cruel. Picture it, a single-room hut, its walls made of mud and straw, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. The fire at the center flickers low, struggling to stay alive. A family sleeps, pressed together on a floor of damp rushes, their breaths rising as mist into the smoky air. No blankets, only coarse wool, body heat, and hope. Outside, the wind cuts like a blade. Inside, it's only slightly softer. This was winter for the medieval peasant, a season of frostbitten mornings, failing harvests, and long nights filled with hunger and prayer. There was no comfort to retreat to, no rescue from the cold. There was only the will to endure and the quiet knowledge that many would not. This is the story of how they did. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Medieval homes didn't insulate. They whispered secrets to the wind. The walls were made of sticks, dung, and hope. The roof was straw pretending to be a real roof. Windows? If you were lucky, there was a hole in the wall covered by something that used to be an animal. A promise that didn't keep anything out. If you were rich, you might have glass the size of a postage stamp. If you were a peasant, you prayed the hole in the wall didn't just become the wall. People didn't survive winter by living well. They survived it by cheating death every single night, one ember, one breath, one damp sock at a time. There were no warm bedrooms to retreat to. The idea of a room was laughable. Most peasants lived in a single-room hut, which was both bedroom and barn. The animals weren't in a separate stable. They were right there with you, chewing cud, farting impressively, and occasionally lying on your sibling. And honestly, that was great, because the cow was warm, the pig was warmer, and if the goat bit your toe in the middle of the night, you still didn't move. You accepted it. That was your heating system. Peasants didn't dress for fashion. They dressed for not dying. Layers of wool, linen, fur scraps, whatever they could afford, or more often, whatever hadn't been chewed through by rats. Their clothes were heavy, itchy, and smelled like history. But they kept your organs where they belonged, unfrozen. You became your own walking wardrobe. And if someone said, "Wow, you look thick today," that was a compliment. It meant you might live through the night. And food. Forget variety. If it came from a root, you ate it. If it was bread, you hoped it was still mostly bread. A good winter stew had the consistency of mud and the mystery of religion. But it filled your belly and kept your body burning calories to stay alive. That's all that mattered. No one cared about flavor when their breath froze on the inside of their nose. Night was the worst. Not because of fear or monsters, but because that's when the temperature dropped low enough to make your knees ache just from existing. Fires had to be carefully maintained, watched, and banked under ashes so they could be revived at dawn. If you let it go out, you weren't just cold. Restarting a fire in the middle of a medieval night meant scraping flint, nursing a spark, and whispering every saint's name you could remember. And if it failed, you might be the reason your little brother didn't wake up. But here's the astonishing thing. They didn't give up. They cursed, they grumbled, they huddled and cried, but they endured. They patched holes in the walls with cloth soaked in grease. They wrapped their feet in old rags and shoved them into wooden clogs. They shared beds, food, fire, and prayers. They formed a living organism, fused by necessity. In the medieval winter, the cold didn't knock. It moved in. It sat at the table. It slept. It whispered in your ear. And if you didn't fight back with everything you had, your breath, your clothes, your fire, your family, it took something from you, a night of sleep, or your very life. So the next time you shiver in your insulated apartment, sipping hot tea under a microfleece blanket, just remember, your ancestors survived colder nights with less hope and more goats. And somehow they lived. If a medieval peasant invited you over to their house, your first reaction might be, "Oh, where is it?" And then they'd point at what looks like an abandoned pile of compost with a thatched roof and say, "Right there." Because, to our modern eyes, a peasant's house was not so much a building as it was a temporary suggestion that shelter might exist. Their homes were called wattle and daub cottages, which sounds almost poetic until you find out what that actually means. Wattle was a fancy word for thin sticks woven together like a basket, and daub was a glorious cocktail of mud, straw, hay, and animal dung, lovingly slapped onto those sticks to create what people at the time called walls and what we today might call sad vertical compost. In theory, this sticky mixture hardened into something like insulation. In practice, the walls cracked when it froze, crumbled when it rained, and offered about the same resistance to the wind as a wet napkin. Still, peasants patched it constantly with new daub, adding fresh manure like it was medieval stucco, because you did what you had to do. Survival didn't smell good. Then there was the roof, or more precisely, the upside down nest that leaked regret. Thatched roofs were made of straw layered over beams, tied down with twine, sticks, and hope. They were great at letting in wildlife, mice, insects, birds, and if you were lucky, an entire squirrel family. When it rained, the thatch held up surprisingly well until it didn't. Peasants would plug leaks with rags, reeds, turf, or just shift their straw bed to the driest corner and pretend it wasn't dripping on their face. And forget ceiling height. You could practically comb your hair with the rafters. Some homes were so low you had to crouch to move around. And if it worked, if the fire caught in the morning, if the baby woke up with pink fingers, if the snow melted just a little early that year, you gave thanks. You made the sign of the cross. You whispered the saint's name into the rising smoke. And you started the day all over again, dirty, tired, hungry, but blessed. For all the rituals, layering, fire tending, and ironclad will, not every peasant made it through the winter. Some were all lost quietly. Some were found, half curled, mid prayer. Some vanished in the snow between home and field and were discovered in spring, still holding the last bundle of firewood they tried to carry home. Because sometimes the cold didn't just bite. The upside, the smoke from your hearth only choked you at knee level. And the people left behind told the stories. There. But to remember, there was the family whose roof caved in under heavy snow. A storm came down so fast the thatch gave up mid-supper. No one had time to move. The neighbors found them days later, all five huddled in what used to be the warmest corner, a pile of wool, bone, and ash. There was the boy who tried to fetch water from the stream one dawn, barefoot, because he'd given his only shoes to his sister. His body was found a month later, arms frozen around the bucket. Ah, yes, the smoke ceiling. There were entire villages that didn't answer the priest's knock in spring. Homes with no smoke from the chimney, no footprints, no barking dogs. Just the stillness that made even the birds pause. The frost claimed fingers, ears, toes, and then it claimed names. Because in the worst winters, when food ran out and kindling became rare as gold, people didn't record losses. They buried them in silence or didn't bury them at all. And yet, the stories remained. They were told around surviving fires. Let's talk about the chimney, or the lack thereof. Whispered to children not as fairy tales, but as warnings. Don't let the hearth go cold, or you'll end up like old Myren, who tried to sleep through a blizzard. Never take the shortcut through the woods when the snow is high, unless you want to join the frost lost. Always thank the saints when you wake up, because not everyone does. They told of the great winter, 1315, When rain drowned the crops, cold stole the rest, and famine walked through Europe like a plague in muddy boots. Peasants dug through frozen mud for roots, made soup from boiled leather and hope. Some whispered that people ate people, though no one ever admitted it directly. Look, most homes didn't have one. A too long silence when the story reached its darkest point. Even the fire wasn't always loyal. There were stories of sparks leaping from hearths and catching rushes on fire, burning down whole huts in the dead of night. Of mothers running barefoot into the snow with two children in her arms and a third she couldn't carry. Of fathers trying to dig through frozen earth by hand to bury the dead because the shovel had snapped in the cold. And then there were the ones who simply gave up. You could tell, they said, when a person stopped tending the fire, stopped checking the roof. They had a hole in the roof and the vague hope that smoke would find its way out. Stopped talking, sat too long by the coals with their back to the room. That kind of stillness had a smell. But not everyone survived. But here's what's remarkable. The ones who did, they carried those stories with them. Not to no, but to honor. Sometimes it did. Not as fear, but as fuel. A fire kept not in the hearth, but in memory. Because remembering who didn't make it and how became part of how you did. Each scar, each empty chair, each cracked wall someone never got to patch, they became part of the living winter map. You moved through the season guided by them, just as you moved through the forest guided by the stars. And yet, grief had no time to dress itself in poetry. People still needed to eat, to gather wood, to patch roofs, to tell jokes. More often, it filled the room like a fog bank made of regret. A child might be buried in the morning, and turnip stew made that afternoon. There was no luxury for long mourning, but there was always a moment before sleep when the room fell quiet and the missing were felt. Names were carved living, just remembered in repetition. That was Ida's stool. This was Brahm's cloak. Don't step there. That's where father fell in the frost. Even ghost stories took root, not of malevolence, but of presence. Your eyes watered, your throat burned, and your clothes absorbed the smoke so thoroughly that people could smell you coming before they saw you. I heard him near the fire last night, someone would say. Just a crackle. Like when he used to stir the coals with the bent iron hook. And no one would question it. Because in a world that killed you slowly, the only warmth stronger than fire was memory. But make no mistake, there was anger too. Peasants might have prayed, but they also cursed the wind. And yet, this was normal. Even God, sometimes. The fire wouldn't catch, and your child's cough had gone from dry to wet, and the priest hadn't visited in weeks. Some turned bitter. Some turned silent. But many simply turned back to the tasks. One more pot of stew. One more night pressed against the wall, listening to the wind scream like it wanted everything you had. You lived in a hut where you were always either slightly wet, slightly burned, slightly itchy, or slightly smoked. Because winter didn't just steal people, it tried to steal hope. And somehow, peasants refused to give it up. They lit another fire. They taught the next generation how to bank embers. They retold the stories, the dark ones, the frozen ones, so that even when winter won, it wouldn't win completely. They left no diaries, but it was yours. No great monuments carved with their names. Medieval peasants did not write their wisdom in books because they had no ink, no paper, and usually no time to sit down and reflect on the beauty of frostbite. And yet, they taught us more than we realize. Not through speeches or sermons, but through their acts, repeated, stubborn, unglamorous acts of survival. They taught us that life isn't about thriving in comfort, but enduring in hardship. That a good night's sleep doesn't require a feather bed, but shared warmth, a banked fire, and the sheer refusal to stop breathing when the world begs you to. They taught us that resilience doesn't always look noble. Sometimes it looks like a mother wrapping her child in a goat-smelling blanket, muttering a prayer with her back to the wind. Sometimes it looks like a 12-year-old dragging a log twice his weight across a frozen yard because there's no one else to do it. And it kept you, more or less, out of the wind. Sometimes it looks like silence, not despair, but focus. The lesson wasn't suffer quietly. It was continue anyway, even when the floor freezes, even when the stew is thin, even when the snow covers the path, and your fingers no longer obey commands. You light the fire again. You check the roof. You slap your boots against the post and go outside because the animals need feeding. They showed us that dignity doesn't require comfort, that you can wear rags and still walk tall, that you can smell of wood smoke and still love your spouse, that you can have nothing and still give your last potato to a neighbor whose hut collapsed in the night. Their values were not written in creeds. They were lived in cold mornings and soot-blackened fingers. Protect the fire. Boo. Protect each other. Don't waste what you'll wish you had in February. They passed down knowledge the way one passes down embers, carefully, wrapped in moss and memory. You didn't ask a child to remember the great winter. You told them how to fix a hole in the wall before the frost found it. That was your story. That was your inheritance. They never said, "We are strong." They simply were. There was strength in routine, in chores done without applause, in the way they sang while stacking wood or argued over stew portions like it was a family sport, in the way they stared down the frost, unshaven, unimpressed, and got on with it. And somehow, in a world of ash and ice, they found joy. At best, you had a few tiny slits covered by oiled cloth, animal hide, or a wooden shutter that closed with a piece of twine. The real miracle isn't that they survived, it's that they laughed. They told jokes, ones about the priest's new shoes or the goat that bit Father Elric. They found humor in the wind, knocking over the outhouse, and in the baby chewing the candle. They found reasons to smile even when their toes were blue, not because they were naive, but because hope is its own rebellion. They believed in things bigger than themselves, not just saints or God, but each other. They didn't survive alone. Glass existed, yes, but only in churches and castles. They survived with family, with neighbors, with animals, with shared silence and shared soup. They endured not by hoarding strength, but by spreading it as thin as stew across a long table and still making it enough. They never said community is important. They just opened the door when the storm hit and made room by the fire. They taught us not to measure life in luxury, but in endurance, in loyalty, in memory. They taught us that sometimes survival is not a battle, but a daily agreement with the cold. You may come in, but you will not take us all. And though they are long gone, their lessons remained. You can see them in every modern person who lays an extra blanket over someone else instead of keeping it for themselves. In every old house where smoke curls from a chimney just before dawn, because someone still gets up to tend the fire. In every act of quiet caregiving, when no one is watching, when no reward is coming, when the world is still asleep. If you were a peasant with glass, you were either dreaming or had stolen it. Those are the echoes of the peasant's soul. And perhaps the greatest thing they taught us is this: we are not entitled to warmth. We build it. We earn it. We protect it for ourselves and for others. So tonight, if the wind howls and you feel grateful for your roof, your bed, your heater, your modern miracles, light a small flame in your mind. For the woman who slept beside a pig for warmth. For the child who tended the coals while his father snored. For the man who gave up his blanket for his mother and never woke up again. They did not survive by chance. Doors, rough wooden planks hung on handmade hinges, secured with wooden bars. They survived by will. And when winter knocked, they didn't answer with fear. They answered with fire. They didn't exactly lock, but most people didn't need them to. No one was going to steal your hay bed or your turnip soup. There were easier targets. Floors? That's a generous word. Most peasant floors were the ground, patted down by generations of feet, sometimes strewn with straw or rushes to keep it slightly less muddy. In winter, it was a solid sheet of frozen dirt. In spring, a mud wrestling pit, and always just a bit damp. Inside, the layout was what modern real estate agents would call open concept, and what medieval people would call the only room. Everything happened in the same space: cooking, eating, sleeping, praying, arguing, childbirth, livestock management, and death. It was less multifunctional and more non optional. There were no closets, no pantries, no cabinets. Belongings were few and precious, often hung from pegs or placed in baskets. Dishes were wooden, pots were iron if you were lucky, and the dining table was just a plank with dreams. Furniture was minimal: a stool, maybe a bench, and a straw stuffed sack to sit or sleep on. Chairs were a luxury. Having more than one was practically showing off. Lighting came from the fire. Candles were rare and expensive. If you had one, you didn't light it unless a saint was visiting or you were dying, and sometimes not even then. The fire glowed dimly, casting dancing shadows across your smoky walls, giving everything the ambiance of a haunted sauna. And yet, in all this gloom and soot and dung-daubed walls, there was life. Children learned to walk across dirt floors. Grandparents told stories beside the fire. Meals, no matter how simple, were shared. People joked, sang, whispered, cried, and dreamed. The house may have been cold, filthy, and one strong gust away from collapse, but it was a home. What did it smell like? That's a complicated question. Imagine smoke, animal sweat, fermented hay, human sweat, damp wool, unwashed feet, cooked turnips, and something faintly moldy but impossible to identify. Add in the occasional goat fart and you're close. But people got used to it, or more accurately, they stopped noticing. When everyone smells like burnt stew and shoe leather, there's no one left to impress. Despite all this hardship, the peasant's home was a symbol of endurance. It was made with hands, patched with love, and defended against weather, hunger, and time with relentless care. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't safe, but it was real, a breathing, creaking, muddy miracle of survival. So the next time your Wi Fi drops or the heater makes a weird noise, take a moment. Think of a peasant child in the year 1293, blowing gently on a dying ember while her father patches the roof with cow dung. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and sometimes that was just enough. If you've ever argued with a sibling over who took the blankets, try imagining a world where the blanket was a damp wool sack you shared with six other people, two goats, and the faint hope that you wouldn't freeze to death by dawn. Welcome to medieval peasant bedtime, where the warmth was shared, the smells were immersive, and privacy was about as realistic as a dragon sighting. No, forget ums. Even the word sleep needs quotation marks when you're talking about peasants in January. What they called sleep, we might call long, cold, unconscious trembling. But they made it work. Let's start with the bed. Most peasants didn't have one. If they did, it was more of a platform, made of rough wood, filled with straw or hay, maybe old rushes, and the occasional opportunistic flea. Low mattress. Nose. And if you were lucky enough to own sheets, they were probably just more rough wool you'd already worn that day. Comfort was not the goal. Survival was. And so, peasants developed what can only be described as the human lasagna sleeping technique. Layering bodies the way you might layer cabbage in a stew you're hoping will feed 10. Everyone piled together in the warmest corner of the one-room home, limbs tangled like medieval spaghetti, each person both radiator and blanket to someone else. The prime spot? Dead center. That's where the warmth accumulated, where the temperature was highest, and where children and the elderly were tucked like priced turnips. Out on the edges were the hardier souls. Older children, sturdy parents, Anyone who wouldn't cry if a draft stole their last toe. This wasn't favoritism. It was strategy. You kept your heat-generating babies alive in the core and your tougher relatives out on the frost-bitten fringe. It was warmth by human architecture. Clothes, you didn't change out of them. You layered more on top. Socks trade on. Cloaks were added. Hats, if you had one, stayed snug on your head. Yes, even indoors. Medieval wisdom understood what modern influencers forget. Most heat escapes through the head. The real tragedy was when your brother stole your hat mid-snore. Wars have started over less. Sharing a bed meant sharing the sweet puffs of garlic breath from stew. No, but also lice. The occasional goat who wandered over for a sniff and decided you looked flammable. People didn't complain. Or rather, they did, but no one cared. You needed that body heat, whether you liked the person or not, whether they drooled or not, whether they had dreams loud enough to wake the dead or not. You stayed close. Children were wrapped like bundles, often tied into their wool layers like little human sausages. They barely moved. Sometimes they peed the bed. No one was surprised. The floor absorbed it, or the straw, or the dog lying at your feet who sighed with ancient disappointment. Sleep itself was not a single long stretch, as we imagine today. It was segmented. Peasants often practiced first sleep and second sleep, a few hours of unconsciousness followed by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. During this time, people stoked the fire, whispered prayers, worried, or just sat staring at the embers. Then they tried to doze off again for a second round of fitful half sleep. Why didn't they just sleep through the night? Because they couldn't. The cold made it impossible. The fire needed tending, and someone always needed to roll over, which often meant everyone had to roll over like synchronized swimmers made of exhaustion. Arguing horrendous happened. Overhead. Stop breathing on me. That's my leg. But no one left the pile because no one wanted to die. The cold was not a joke. You didn't risk a draft just because your sister kicked you in the ribs. You then accepted it. You endure. Sometimes sleeping arrangements changed nightly. Families rotated spots. You might get to sleep near the fire one night and end up next to the door the next. That was the cold lottery, a game no one wanted to win. And there were the night sounds. A medieval peasant night was not silent. Between the shifting bodies, the crackling fire, the wind howling through the wall gaps, the snorting pig by the hearth, and the occasional chicken muttering in its dreams, it was a symphony of discomfort. And through it all, people tried to stay warm enough to wake up. Did it work? Sometimes. Not always. Frostbite claimed toes. Sleep deprivation claimed tempers. Children didn't always survive the night, especially if the fire died and the draft got in. But for the most part, these people made it work through ritual, discipline, and an unholy amount of cuddling. If a stranger wandered in and saw you and your family sleeping under piles of wet wool and straw, wrapped around each other like tangled roots, they might have been horrified. But if they stayed long enough, they'd realize something else. There was love here, hidden beneath the smoke and fleas and coughing. Because when you sleep touching your entire family every night of your life, you learn the value of being alive together. Yes, medieval sleep was lumpy, loud, and often smelly. Yes, the bed was also the floor. Yes, the fire was never strong enough. But the people inside those huts made do. They made jokes. They shared stories. They whispered lullabies while the wind screamed at the windows. And maybe, just maybe, they found a kind of peace in the closeness, in the knowledge that no matter how bad it got outside, they were inside. If you had to name the single most important object in a medieval peasant's life, it wasn't a sword, or a plow, or even a bowl of soup. It was the fire. That smoky, stubborn, temperamental pile of warmth was more than just a convenience. It was the line between life and death, between morning breath and a frozen final sigh. Fire wasn't just for cooking, it was for surviving. It was the central heating, the stove, the light source, the pest deterrent, the air freshener, sort of, and the emotional support blaze for entire families. Without it, a winter night became a countdown. Let's be clear, fire in a medieval hut wasn't glamorous. No grand fireplace framed by carved stone. Low chimney, just a shallow pit in the middle of a single room house, maybe ringed with rocks, filled with half burned logs, bits of animal fat, and sheer desperation. The smoke, theoretically, escaped through a hole in the roof. In practice, it lingered, filling the room until your eyes teared up and your lungs began writing you angry letters. Visitors would walk into your home and immediately discover religion. Kept coughing. But nobody complained, not seriously, because a smoky hut was a warm hut, and that meant you might live through the night. Now here's where things get tricky. The fire had to stay alive. Night. And not just during some ceremonial occasion. Literally every single dusk to dawn cycle. Because if it died, you didn't just lose the heat. You lost your food source, your light, your protection from wild animals, and your only halfway decent excuse to stay indoors. Restarting a fire from scratch was not just a matter of clicking a lighter. There were no matches, no gas stoves, no electric. Lighting a fire meant scraping flint against steel, hoping for a single miraculous spark, and then coddling that spark with dry moss, bark shavings, and the kind of whispered prayers that make saints pause. And remember, everything was cold and damp. You might have spent all day hauling wood only to discover that it was wetter than your shirt after a winter storm. And if your kindling was wet, congratulations. You've just invented misery. So peasants developed a method as old as anxiety itself. Fire banking. Every night before bed, someone, usually the person with the fewest blisters, would bury the embers under a thick layer of ash. This ash acted like a smothering blanket, keeping the coals just alive enough to revive at dawn. Done correctly, fire banking gave you a warm head start. You'd wake, scratch at the ashes, add kindling, and hopefully have a roaring flame before your fingertips went completely numb. Done incorrectly, well, the cold would notice, and it never missed an invitation. Every family had their own secrets. Some insisted on dry ash only. Others swore a little dampness, kept the devil out. Some mounted the ash tall like a haystack. Others flattened it like a pastry. Arguments were frequent and serious, because if the fire didn't catch in the morning, someone was going to be very, very unpopular for the rest of the week. And just when you thought things couldn't get more dramatic, entered the night watch. Yes, sleep came in shifts. Someone had to poke the fire. Stop the goat from stepping into it. That someone rotated, the strong, the tired, the responsible, the guilty. You'd stumble from the human lasagna pile, wrap yourself in rags, and tiptoe across the frozen dirt floor to stare at flickering coals like they were the last light in the world. Because, in a way, they were. Children old enough to hold a stick were trained in fire duty. Don't let it go out wasn't a suggestion. It was doctrine. Parents passed down techniques, tricks, stories of the time Uncle Bram slept through his shift, and the next morning they had to cook breakfast outside, in the snow, using a shovel and some borrowed coals from the neighbor who definitely did not let him forget it. Sometimes, despite all the effort, the fire died anyway. A gust of wind, a spill, a clumsy foot, a heavy snowstorm leaking through the roof, and suddenly you were in deep frozen trouble. That's when community came in. A neighbor might lend you a glowing coal, or let you crouch by their hearth long enough to restart your own. But the shame? Oh, the shame. To be the house that let its fire die in midwinter was like forgetting your baby in the cabbage field. People talked. Jokes were made. Need help breathing too? They'd say with a grin, handing you a burning stick and an insult. And yet, the hearth was more than just a pile of logs. It was the beating heart of the home. People gathered around it to talk, sing, sew, plan, grieve. Children learned to walk by, toddling in the dim glow. Old stories were told in the embers, where flickers of light danced like ghosts from better seasons. It was warmth and memory and survival woven together. The fire was both daily ritual and quiet religion. It was a god they fed, protected, feared. It warmed their feet and their food and their fragile hopes. And when it crackled, when it held through the night, when it sparked back to life with a few twigs and a soft breath, it felt like victory, not a grand one, but a stubborn, ordinary, precious one. The kind that meant you were still here. If you ever find yourself in the middle of a medieval winter, the first thing you'll need, after a fire and a strong will to live, is layers. Not stylish layers. Not Instagrammable layers. Just as many scratchy, heavy, smelly, awkward layers as your body can physically tolerate before you become more wool than man. Because in the peasant world, your clothes weren't a statement. They were armor against the cold. And while they wouldn't win any beauty contests unless the judges were goats, they were the difference between waking up stiff and waking up dead. Let's start from the inside out. The base layer was usually a linen shirt or shift, unbleached, often inherited from someone who'd already sweated in it for 3 winters straight. These garments were rarely washed. Why? Because washing clothes in the middle of winter required breaking ice, losing feeling in your fingers, and then waiting 3 days for it to dry, if it didn't freeze into a solid, wearable plank of linen first. Over that, wool. Lot of wool. Tunics, dresses, leggings, cloaks. Wool was the duct tape of medieval survival. It scratched like betrayal, stank like ambition, and sagged in all the wrong places. But it trapped heat. And if your wool clothes were already crusted with smoke, grease, and several layers of mystery grime, all the better. That outer film acted as a medieval gore, tex, holding in warmth and keeping out wind. Sure, it also kept out social invitations, but peasants weren't worried about parties. Then there were the trousers. For men, these were often tied at the waist with a string, worn under long tunics, and tucked into whatever foot protection was available. For women, layered skirts made from the same coarse materials did the trick. Obviously, optional. Warmth, mandatory. Shoes were their own adventure. Leather boots existed, sure, but peasants rarely had access to those unless they inherited a pair or made them by hand. More often, feet were wrapped in strips of cloth, layered again and again, and shoved into wooden clogs, crude sandals, or sometimes just old leather tied on with hope. In deep cold, people simply added more cloth until their feet resembled woolen hoofs. And gloves? Hats? If you had them, you protected them like treasure. Woolen caps were worn indoors and out. A good hat could make the difference between keeping your ears or giving them up to frostbite. Scarves were long strips of cloth, worn over the nose and mouth, especially at night, to avoid inhaling air cold enough to kill your lungs one breath at a time. Fashion didn't exist. A peasant wasn't judged by what they wore, but by whether they were still alive, come spring. A truly enviable outfit was one that made you look like you had stolen clothes from 3 different ancestors and sewn them together into a walking hay bale. The more you waddled, the better. Movement meant air gaps. Air gaps meant insulation. You didn't want to look elegant. You wanted to look like you might fall over from sheer volume. Here's the thing though, they didn't change clothes much. The effort required was too great. So layered and layered again. You didn't take something off, you just added more. A peasant in January might be wearing 4 months of laundry. Each layer had its own history. That stain, from when the soup exploded. That hole burned it near the fire. That smell? Well, better not to ask. Dirt, sweat, and oils built up until the fabric stiffened. But all that filth, it was actually helpful. No, seriously. It filled the weave of the fabric, making it more resistant to wind and moisture. The stink might have been lethal to outsiders, but to a peasant, it was the scent of thermal efficiency. Bathing, of course, was rare. Soap was scarce and precious. Washing was often reserved for religious festivals or major life events, like weddings, births, or imminent death. And even then, only the body parts most likely to offend a neighbor got attention. The upside? Everyone smelled equally bad. There was no perfume class divide. If you wandered into a peasant village in winter, you didn't so much smell individuals as inhale a single collective musk like hay, firewood, onions, and wet wool left in a bag for a week. It was democratic. No one escaped it, and no one expected to. Children were dressed like overstuffed vegetables, bundled into so many layers they could barely walk. Mothers wrapped them in wool, linen, and anything that resembled fabric, then stuffed them near the fire like human dumplings. They didn't whine about being itchy. They were busy trying to breathe through three scarves. Even bedtime clothing was a matter of layering. You didn't get undressed. You didn't change into pajamas. You just lay down in what you'd worn all day and added more if you could. If your cloak doubled as a blanket, great. If your shirt stiffened overnight from frost, just warm it by the fire and wear it again. And in all this, peasants were grateful. A cloak passed down from a grandparent was sacred. A new pair of wool socks was like winning the medieval lottery. A sheepskin coat, even moth-eaten and patchy, was a status symbol, a literal lifesaver, and a reason to gloat slightly to your neighbor while pretending to be modest. Their clothing didn't sparkle. It didn't shine, but it was built on centuries of practical wisdom, trial and error tailoring, and the knowledge that fashion dies quickly in a blizzard. So the next time you complain about your hoodie not being thick enough or your jacket being last season, imagine waking up in a hut where your hair froze to the wall overnight and your best defense was a tunic someone else died in, but it still holds heat. That, my friend, is what they called style. Let's get one thing straight. In the medieval peasant world, bathing was not a vibe. It was a threat, a hazard, an activity done only under duress, suspicion of plague, or extreme religious guilt. And even then, it was approached with the enthusiasm of a man being dragged toward the gallows holding a sponge. In the middle of a freezing European winter, suggesting that someone strip down, soak themselves in cold water, and then stand around waiting to dry was like recommending self-sabotage. It was borderline criminal advice. Because you didn't just risk shivering, you risked death. Pneumonia, hypothermia, frozen limbs, and judgmental stares from your grandmother. All for what? Slightly less grime? Peasants had priorities, and smelling like a tulip didn't make the list. Survival came first. And somewhere in the late 20s, just after avoid wolves, was basic hygiene. This wasn't entirely due to laziness or superstition. It was practical. Clean skin lost heat faster. Damp hair froze. Wet undergarments turned into icy fabric torture devices. And soap? That was a luxury commodity, often handmade, harsh, expensive, and reserved for the nobility, monks, or people who had just died and needed to look semi-presentable for judgment. When peasants did wash, it was usually partial. A quick splash to the face, a dab behind the ears if you were feeling decadent, a wipe of the hands if you were about to eat something not entirely made of dirt. But full body bathing? That was a festival event, really public, sometimes scandalous, and always chilly happening. Let's say, hypothetically, you decided to bathe anyway. Now go find some water. A stream, maybe. Oh, look, it's frozen solid. Better hope you brought a hammer. And once you break the ice, congratulations. You've made a medieval ice bath. Enjoy your sins being washed away, along with your circulation. There were no indoor plumbing systems, no tiled baths with scented candles. If you wanted a hot bath, you had to 1. Haul water from a well or stream. Heat it over a fire, which already had to heat your food, your room, and your cow. Pour it into a wooden tub that leaked slightly and smelled like root vegetables. Good choice. Take turns, because no one was wasting that much firewood just for you. And yes, it was a shared bath. First come, best soak. By the time the third person climbed in, the water looked like a weak soup made from regret and armpits. And yet, still better than dying of frostbite. Some peasants used communal bathhouses, if their village had one. These were often basic wooden buildings with smoke, steam, and enough nudity to make a monk faint. But in many places, bathhouses fell out of favor entirely, especially once people started associating them with sin, immorality, and the occasional plague outbreak. That's right, people began to believe that opening your pores made you vulnerable to disease. And since medieval medicine was more theory than fact, that belief stuck like mildew. By the 14th century, some even preached that washing too often was vanity, and vanity, of course, led straight to eternal damnation, right between gluttony and owning more than one pair of shoes. So people leaned into alternative cleanliness strategies. One favorite method, layering filth like insulation. The grime that built up over winter created a crust, a barrier, if you will, between your skin and the elements. Dirt and oils filled the fabric of your clothes, clogged the pores of your tunics, and provided a surprisingly effective layer of weatherproofing. Was it itchy? Yes. Was it fragrant? Also yes. But did it work? Apparently. There were dry shampoos, medieval style, powders made from herbs, ashes, or ground up roots sprinkled into hair to absorb grease and add a hint of smells slightly less like sheep. People combed their hair regularly, not just for style, but to remove lice, eggs, and the occasional leaf that had made itself at home. Clothing itself was rarely washed. It took too much effort, too much water, and too much time to dry. If it wasn't stiff with dirt, it wasn't done being useful. Instead, people layered fresh-ish garments over older ones, like geological strata of toil and sweat. Occasionally, peasants might beat their clothes against rocks or hang them in smoke to kill bugs and curses. That was the medieval version of dry cleaning. Peasants had something resembling undertunics, sure, but don't expect anything close to modern briefs. And changing them was a monthly celebration, depending on ambition and weather. What's remarkable, though, is that they didn't seem to mind. Not in the way we might. Smells were alternative. If everyone reeked like wood smoke and body odor with a dash of goat cheese, no one was offended. There was a communal acceptance of stench. And within that cloud of humanity, people still flirted, married, and procreated, proving that love truly conquers all. To cover the worst of the smell, people wore herbs, lavender, rosemary, sage, tucked into belts, sewn into collars, or worn as garlands. Not just to smell nice, but to ward off illness and bad vibes. It was olfactory magic. If I smell like rosemary, maybe the plague will skip me. Honestly, worth a try. So, no, bathing wasn't routine. It wasn't even welcome. Sometimes scandalous, and entirely non-essential to the business of staying alive. In fact, bathing too much was seen as suspicious, a sign that maybe you had too much free time, too many resources, or something to hide. What were you trying to scrub away, exactly? So the next time someone tells you to take a shower, just smile and say, actually, I'm preserving my holy protective filth layer. For history, you now have medieval peasant street cred. If you think your roommate's snoring is bad, try sharing your bed with a full-grown cow. Or a pill, or a pig, or a goat that thinks your blanket is edible and your hair is personal property. Welcome to medieval peasant winter survival, where sleeping with animals wasn't a weird backwoods rumor, it was a necessity. Not because peasants loved the farm life more than everyone else, but because in the war against freezing to death, a warm goat was worth more than personal space, dignity, or silence. Let's get this out of the way. Medieval homes didn't have barns in the modern sense. at least not for most peasants. There was one structure, often a single room, maybe with a partition if someone was feeling fancy, one side for people, the other for animals. But let's be honest, by midwinter, those sites stopped existing. Everyone slept wherever the heat collected, and animals generated a lot of heat. Cows, especially, were prized winter companions. Not only were they walking space heaters, but they were also heavy enough that they stayed put once they flopped down. You could rest a cold foot against one and genuinely feel your soul come back online. Their cut-chewing rhythm even provided a kind of soothing nighttime soundtrack, like a very moist lullaby. Pigs, surprisingly toasty. Thick bodies, low to the ground, always looking for a place to plop. If you could ignore the snorting and the smell, both of which were aggressive, you had a solid heating unit. Plus, pigs didn't mind contact. They'd nestle right in and stay there. The only risk was accidentally spooning one, then waking up in a panic because your blanket oinked. Goats, meanwhile, were smaller and more mobile, which made them both a blessing and a menace. They'd curl up beside you like little fireballs, but then suddenly stand up at 3000 A, stomp across your face, and chew on your sleeve. Sometimes they stared at you while you slept. No one knew why. It was unsettling. But again, warmth. Chickens roosted in the rafters or corners, rarely joining the cuddle pile but offering their own kind of company. You might drift off to the soft cluck cluck of a hen, commenting on your fire stoking technique. Some families tucked hens under baskets at night, both to keep them warm and to stop them from wandering across your sleeping children. And let's not forget the dogs and cats, when peasants had them. Dogs were welcome companions, loyal, warm, and frequently used as mobile feet warmers. Cats, well, they did their own thing. Occasionally slept on your chest, occasionally knocked things into the fire, frequently judged your life choices with unblinking eyes. Of course, sleeping with animals wasn't glamorous. It was loud. It was messy. It was intensely aromatic. Imagine trying to fall asleep to the symphony of a cow farting like thunder, a pig snoring like it's digging its own grave, a goat chewing its cud and occasionally screaming for no reason, a chicken laying an egg next to your pillow. Now add in the scent cocktail, sweat, dung, straw, smoke, old wool, and whatever that damp spot is near the corner that nobody talks about. Still, nobody complained, because it was better than freezing. Animals radiated warmth better than humans did. Their body temperature ran higher. Their fur trapped heat. And unlike people, they didn't roll over and steal the blanket. It just existed, sometimes awkwardly in your lap. This system wasn't just about comfort, it was strategy. Keeping animals indoors meant body heat in the room, body protection from thieves or predators, bone, and a shorter commute to your morning chores. In bad storms, people would even bring animals that normally stayed outside, like sheep or young calves, into the house. Not for pampering, for survival, theirs and yours. Of course, not every peasant loved this setup. Some dreamed of separate barns, multiple rooms, or a life where a pig didn't sneeze in their face while they were half asleep. But they all understood one thing: cold doesn't care about boundaries. If sharing your home with a goat meant you lived another day, you welcomed that goat like family. Children, especially, formed tight bonds with the animals. They'd name the pigs, sing to the hens, and whisper secrets to the cows. And when one of them got sick, the sadness was real. Because these weren't just livestock, they were survival companions. They breathed alongside you, warmed your house, and asked for nothing in return except not to be eaten. At least not immediately. To modern ears, it might sound unhygienic, borderline absurd, but to a peasant, it was just life. A messy, noisy, smelly equation where everyone, human and animal, huddled together in a fragile circle of shared heat and stubborn will. So the next time you curl up under a clean duvet with a space heater purring in the corner, give thanks. You're not fighting over elbow space with a goat. If you think your roommate's snoring is bad, try sharing your bed with a full-grown cow. Or a goat that thinks your blanket is edible and your hair is personal property. Welcome to medieval peasant winter survival, where sleeping with animals wasn't a weird backwoods rumor, it was a necessity. Not because peasants loved the farm life more than everyone else, but because in the war against freezing to death, a warm goat was worth more than personal space, dignity, or silence. Let's get this out of the way. Medieval homes didn't have barns in the modern sense, at least not for most peasants. There was one structure, often a single room, maybe with a partition if someone was feeling fancy. One side for people, the other for animals. But let's be honest, by midwinter, those sides stopped existing. Everyone slept wherever the heat collected, and animals generated a lot of heat. Cows, especially, were prized winter companions. Not only were they walking space heaters, but they were also heavy enough that they stayed put once they flopped down. You could rest a cold foot against one and genuinely feel your soul come back online. Their cut-chewing rhythm even provided a kind of soothing nighttime soundtrack, like a very moist lullaby. Pigs, surprisingly toasty. Thick bodies, low to the ground, always looking for a place to plop. If you could ignore the snorting and the smell, both of which were aggressive, you had a solid heating unit. Plus, pigs didn't mind contact. They'd nestle right in and stay there. The only risk was accidentally spooning one, then waking up in a panic because your blanket oinked. Goats, meanwhile, were smaller and more mobile, which made them both a blessing and a menace. They'd curl up beside you like little fireballs, but then suddenly stand up at 3,000 a day, stomp across your face, and chew on your sleeve. Sometimes they stared at you while you slept. No knew why. It was unsettling. But again, warmth. Chickens, roosted in the rafters or corners, rarely joining the cuddle pile, but offering their own kind of company. You might drift off to the soft cluck cluck of a hen, commenting on your fire stoking technique. Some families tucked hens under baskets at night, both to keep them warm and to stop them from wandering across your sleeping children. And let's not forget the dogs and cats when peasants had them. Dogs were welcome companions, loyal, warm, and frequently used as mobile feet warmers. Cats, well, they did their own thing. Occasionally slept on your chest, occasionally knocked things into the fire, frequently judged your life choices with unblinking eyes. Of course, sleeping with animals wasn't glamorous. It was messy. It was intensely aromatic. Imagine trying to fall asleep to the symphony of 1. A cow farting like thunder. A. A pig snoring like it's digging its own grave. A. A goat chewing its cud and occasionally screaming for no reason. A chicken laying an egg next to your pillow. Now add in the scent cocktail, sweat, dung, straw, smoke, old wool, and whatever that damp spot is near the corner that nobody talks about. Still, nobody complained, because it was better than freezing. Animals radiated warmth better than humans did. Their body temperature ran higher. Their fur trapped heat, and unlike people, they didn't roll over and steal the blanket. They just existed, sometimes awkwardly in your lap. This system wasn't just about comfort, it was strategy. Keeping animals indoors meant VOD, body heat in the room, protection from thieves or predators, and a shorter commute to your morning chores. In bad storms, people would even bring animals that normally stayed outside, like sheep or young calves, into the house. Not for pampering. Survival. Theirs and yours. Of course, not every peasant loved this setup. Some extracurriculars. Some dreamed of separate barns, multiple rooms, or a life where a pig didn't sneeze in their face while they were half asleep. But they all understood one thing. Cold doesn't care about boundaries. If sharing your home with a goat meant you lived another day, you welcomed that goat-like family. Children, especially, formed tight bonds with the animals. They'd name the pigs, sing to the hens, and whisper secrets to the cows. And when one of them got sick, the sadness was real. Because these weren't just livestock, they were survival companions. They breathed alongside you, warmed your house, and asked for nothing in return except not to be eaten. At least not immediately. To modern ears, it might sound unhygienic, borderline absurd, but to a peasant, it was just life. A messy, noisy, smelly equation where everyone, human and animal, huddled together in a fragile circle of shared heat and stubborn will. So the next time you curl up under a clean duvet with a space heater purring in the corner, give thanks. You're not fighting over elbow space with a goat. When you imagine winter hardships, you might picture snowstorms, cold air, or that tragic moment when your last log turns out to be damp. But for medieval peasants, one of the most underrated, most evil, most soul-numbing enemies was the floor. That's right, not wolves. Cloaked famine, not the angry tax collector with frost in his beard. The floor. Because for most peasants, the floor wasn't wood, or even something you could sweep. It was the ground. Heck, dirt. Sometimes mud. Sometimes ice. Hardwood is cold, and it didn't just stay under your feet. It climbed into your bones. Let's paint the scene. You're in a one-room cottage with daubed walls and a leaking thatch roof. There's a fire in the center. There's straw on the floor. Kind of. And when you lie down to sleep, you realize you're one thin layer of hay away from sleeping directly on Mother Earth's frozen cheek. She is not warm. She is not merciful. In summer, the dirt floor was manageable, crumbly, maybe gave you a bit of texture underfoot. But in winter, it hardened like stone. Goes like Clayton. Sometimes it cracked. Other times it sweated if the outside temperature rose just enough to make the interior a sort of mud sauna. Some families tried to soften the blow with rushes, long grasses thrown across the floor like primitive rugs. Sometimes herbs were mixed in rosemary, lavender, sage, not for luxury, or the smell. Because after a week of snow boots, pig tracks, spilled stew, and four barefoot children playing, let's see who can fall the hardest, the rushes stank. You didn't clean the rushes. You didn't lift them. You just threw fresh ones on top, which meant that by February, you were walking on a living compost pile made of flattened grass, ash, food scraps, small bones, and things no one talked about. But still, better than the bare ground, because the ground didn't just sit there. Cold seeped up from it like a ghost with very cold fingers and no respect for personal space. It slid into your straw bedding. It crept into your boots. It found your knees when you crouched and your back when you tried to sleep. It didn't care if you layered 3 cloaks and hugged a goat to bed. From below, the cold always came. People tried all kinds of tricks to beat it. Some layered extra straw and prayed it wouldn't go moldy before March. Some built up little wooden pallets, if they had enough scraps, to raise their bedding slightly off the earth. Not a bed. A platform. Maybe 3 inches of pride and hope. Others relied on sheepskins, laid thick side down, skin side up, to act as crude thermal insulation. If you were lucky enough to have one that wasn't already part of your wardrobe, you used it for sleeping. If not, you layered hay and tried not to roll over too much. Because if you rolled, you found the soft spots, or wet ones. Let's talk about moisture. When snow melted, or rain leaked through the roof, or the breath of 12 animals slowly condensed over the course of the night, the floor responded. It turned to mush, a dark, squishy, freezing marsh that sucked at your boots and wept through the straw like a broken promise. Some floors even froze and thawed in cycles, creating medieval booby traps. You'd step out of bed in the morning and feel something crunch. Was it straw? Was it ice? Was it something that used to be warm and no longer is? You didn't ask. You just moved faster. And what about going barefoot? Not unless you had a death wish. Most peasants slept in some kind of foot covering, wrapped in rags, old wool, or just the remnants of yesterday's socks. Taking off your footwear to sleep was a rich person's privilege. You kept them on, even if they were damp, even if they were crusty, because the alternative was letting your feet touch the dirt floor, and that was how toes went missing. Let's also acknowledge that the floor wasn't clean, not in the modern sense. There were no brooms, no Swiffers, no shoes off at the door. Rules. People worked, ate, slept, bled, and occasionally gave birth right on that same compacted earth. It absorbed everything. You got nothing. You swept the rushes aside with your foot if you felt motivated. But most of the time, you didn't. You just added more on top and hoped whatever was living underneath wasn't too large to crawl out. Even the fire, glorious as it was, didn't help much. The floor remained frigid. If you sat too long near the fire, your face got roasted and your butt froze. It was a cruel joke, a vertical thermal betrayal. Warm above the knees, frozen below. Still, peasants didn't complain the way we might. They got used to the ache in their knees, the stiffness in their backs, the dampness in their souls. They knew the ground would always be there, waiting, watching, leeching warmth like a hungry spirit. Children learned to walk on it. Elders learned to sit with blankets wrapped around their legs. And everyone learned that when you dropped something on the floor in January, a spoon, a piece of bread, a toe, it was gone forever. Collected by the ground. A cold tax on being alive. So the next time you pad across your warm hardwood floor, or your soft carpet, or your heated bathroom tile, take a moment. Think of a medieval mother trying to rock a baby to sleep, while crouched beside a frozen hay pile, her knees pressed to a floor that would rather kill her than comfort her. She didn't have the rug. She had resolve, and maybe a goat lying across her feet. Just a quick intermission, but I humbly ask you to leave a comment as it helps my channel immensely. If you do not know what to comment, just write what time it is on your country and where do you live, so I know you reached this far. In medieval peasant families, there were no freeloaders. If you had lungs, you had a job. If you could walk without falling into the fire pit, you were old enough to stoke it. And if you couldn't walk at all, you were probably being used as insulation in the middle of the sleeping pile. Because when winter bore down with its icy claws, survival wasn't just about strength. It was about teamwork. And the team included everyone. Toddlers with goat breath, grandmothers with knees louder than the front door, and every sniffling soot-smudged body in between. Let's start with the children. Today, we wrap kids in fleece-lined jackets and worry about whether they're emotionally fulfilled. Medieval peasant kids, they were lucky if their wool tunic didn't have a rat in it. Emotional support came in the form of, "You didn't freeze last night? Good. Now take this bucket." Children were the runners, the wood haulers, the ash scoopers, the emergency ember fetchers. If the fire was sputtering, you didn't send Dad. You sent small, nimble Thomas, barefoot across the crunchy straw, to poke the coals and whisper apologies to St. Brigid. If he got it going again, he was a hero. If he failed, well, it was probably your fault for not feeding him more turnip stew. They also played a critical role in watching for smoke leaks, plugging new wall gaps with moss, and chasing the chicken out of the stew pot. They didn't complain. Or if they did, it was in the form of dramatic coughing near the hearth until someone gave them the warm side of the bench. Even toddlers had roles. No, they didn't chop wood, though some probably tried. But they contributed body heat, and more importantly, they were often placed strategically at the center of the sleep pile, tiny nuclear reactors in woolen wrapping. Parents swaddled them until they couldn't move, then wedged them between warmer bodies and prayed the child didn't start screaming at 2 a.m. and wake the cow. Then there were the elders, the creaky-boned, half-blind, stubborn-eyed veterans of 30 winters who somehow still remembered how to start a fire with a wet twig and a glare. You might think the elderly were exempt from duties. They weren't. In fact, they were often the most trusted fire watchers in the household. Why? Because they woke up a lot anyway. Ladders betrayed. Sleep came in fits and starts. And when they were up, they might as well throw a stick on the fire and mutter something about the cold of '89 when the stream froze inside the hut. They were wisdom keepers too. Grandparents knew how to bank coals just right, how to tell when the roof was sagging dangerously, how to identify the good moss from the bad moss. They remembered when little Ewan forgot to plug the wall last year and everyone woke up with icicles on their eyebrows. And they told those stories nightly. Elders weren't just respected, they were preserved like holy relics. Sleeping spots near the hearth were often given to them, not only out of reverence, but out of simple logistics. Old bones freeze fast. And if Granny turned blue overnight, nobody wanted to be the one to explain it to the priest. There was also something undeniably comforting about their presence. While the wind howled and the fire hissed, Grandma would be there, sitting hunched on a stool, poking the embers with a stick older than sin, whispering half prayers, half curses to the smoke. And if a child coughed, she'd toss a dried herb in the fire, call it medicine, and go back to squinting at the sparks. It wasn't just fire, either. Both children and elders took part in the night shift system, a noble, exhausting rotation of don't let the family freeze to death while everyone else is snoring. There were no clocks, only instinct. You stirred, listened to the silence, panicked slightly, then crawled across the room and checked the embers. Still glowing. Good. Add a stick, not glowing. Start praying. The system wasn't glamorous. No medals. But it worked. A 6-year-old who barely knew his letters might know exactly how many pokes it took to get a coal to breathe again. An old woman with no teeth might have perfect rhythm for feeding the fire without waking. The baby goat curled at her feet. In fact, you could measure the health of a household by how well its fire patrol operated. If the flames never went cold, if the morning embers always sparked easily, if the room was only mostly smoky instead of possibly lethal, then you knew the rhythm of that family was strong. But strong. Because that's the thing, medieval peasants didn't survive winter alone, and they did together. Through groggy shifts, grumbled chores, shared knowledge, and generations of quiet, coordinated effort. The children brought the energy, the elders brought the memory, and somewhere in between, the fire burned on, not brightly, but persistently. So the next time you groan about taking the trash out, picture a 10-year-old from the year 1278 stumbling across a frozen floor in the middle of the night, holding a stick, rubbing ash from their eyes, and hoping, praying, that the coals are still warm. That's not a chore. That's a legacy. In the depths of a medieval winter, with the wind clawing at the walls and the fire sputtering like it had just given up on life, peasants had one final, invisible shield against the cold: faith. Not the cheerful, Sunday best kind of faith. Not faith as pageantry or decoration. No, this was winter faith. Raw, desperate, bone deep belief whispered into smoke and darkness. It wasn't theology, it was survival. When you live in a hut where your toes might not make it to February, you don't just light a fire, you pray it lives. And when it starts to die, you call for saints, Saint Nicholas, Saint Blaise. These weren't abstract figures carved in marble, emergency contexts for problems no human could fix. Each saint had a specialty: one for cold, one for sickness, one for animals, one for children who coughed too much and looked suspiciously pale. In every hut, there was at least one crude wooden icon, a painted scrap, or a blessed object tucked near the hearth. Not because peasants had time to decorate, but because anything that might help was worth having. A saint's name scribbled in charcoal on the lintel, a bit of wax from last Easter's candle, a coin that touched the hem of a pilgrim's cloak. Sacred jumped, maybe. But when the roof leaked and the fire died and the wind blew sideways, it meant something. Before bed, Families would kneel on the cold floor, or whatever passed for floor under the rushes and straw, and whisper prayers, half in Latin, half in sheer panic. Children were taught them as soon as they could speak, not for Vernuhulen. Bless this fire. Bless this roof. Keep the frost out. Keep the rats from chewing through our socks. Gee, let us wake up. All of us. And then they'd blow out the candle. If they had one, faith wasn't just belief, it was ritual. Patterns in the dark. Protective actions passed down like recipes. Sprinkle holy water on the fire before banking it. Cross yourself before pulling the blanket over your face. Never sweep ashes out after sunset. Always face east when lighting a new flame. Don't whistle indoors. Don't let the hearth go silent. It might invite spirits. Because winter, in peasant minds, wasn't just a season, it was a force. A creeping, conscious thing that waited for silence, for carelessness, for cracks in the order of things. And the saints, if respected properly, kept it at bay. There were also feast days, which weren't just celebrations. They were calendars of hope. You knew it was Candlemas when the priest came to bless wax, and your neighbor tried to make a new lantern with pig fat. You knew it was Saint Anthony's Day when you prayed your goat wouldn't die. You marked time not by months, but by saints, beacons in the dark stretch between harvest and spring. And then there was fear, not just fear of cold, but fear of judgment, of punishment, of divine displeasure taking the form of a snowstorm. If your fire kept dying, was it a sign? Had you been selfish, lied, forgotten your prayers? Used the holy candle to light the stew pot? Peasants weren't theologians, but they noticed patterns. The family who skipped Mass had more frostbite. The child who swore at a cow died before Lent. The man who stole wood from the communal pile got struck with what everyone called black toes. Coincidence? Maybe. But you didn't want to test it. They also believed in spirits. Colloidal ones. Drafts weren't just air. They were restless things, sneaking in through the unsealed cracks, dragging chills with them. To stop them, you marked doorways with chalk, burned dried herbs, hung bits of iron near the entrance. All superstitions. All is serious. Because when science fails and warmth runs out, ritual takes over. The church, for its part, understood the power of winter fear. Priests offered blessings for the hearth, the fields, the livestock. They held vigils on long nights, lit candles for the souls of those who didn't make it, preached sermons about endurance, humility, and not cursing when your toes turned purple. It was difficult. Faith didn't guarantee survival, but it framed it, made it bearable. He made it noble. If you froze, maybe you were like the saints. If you suffered, perhaps it had purpose. If your child died, maybe they were now with angels, and not just another tragic number in a village slowly losing count. And yet, for all this reverence, peasants also laughed at God sometimes. A mother joked near the fire about St. Lawrence warming his feet too well. A snort when the priest claimed the frost was a test from heaven, as if frostbite needed holy sanction. Faith was woven with irreverence, not because they didn't believe, but because belief didn't always put soup on the table. Still, every night, someone said a prayer over the embers, not to show off, not to win salvation, but to survive, to nudge the odds slightly in your favor, to ask the invisible for one more day, one more breath, one more ember that didn't go out.